Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. When Israel withdrew its forces and settlements from Gaza 19 years ago, it was a unilateral move only as far as the Palestinian Authority was concerned. There was an agreement between Israel and Egypt regarding the border between Egypt's northern Sinai district at Rafah and the Gaza Strip, codenamed Philadelphi on the Israeli maps. This 14-kilometer ribbon of sand and land from the Mediterranean Sea to Rafah became the focus of major smuggling activities in both directions, enabling the Islamist Hamas to bolster its arsenal and build its vast tunnel network. Now that the IDF is in control of the Philadelphia once again, it turned into both a strategic as well as a political bone of contention. To analyze the importance of the Philadelphia corridor, all the way from the United States, we're joined by Professor Russell Berman, who formerly served as a senior advisor at the foreign planning staff at the U.S. State Department and currently is the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to see you, Russell.
Good to see you, Jonathan.
It's a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from across the pond this time is Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisen, who is just until recently the director of the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University, still a senior fellow there. Nonetheless, she has, of course, a long list of very impressive positions held in the IDF Intelligence Directorate, as well as the Prime Minister's office here in Israel. It's great to see you, Miri.
Hello, Jonathan.
Hello indeed. And with me here in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. It's great to see you as well, Amir.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And with that, I'd like to ask you the first question, beyond setting the stage for us. There are, of course, 2-3 schools of thought regarding the Philadelphia corridor, a topic discussed at length in multiple broadcasts all over the world. Nevertheless, the real ingredients of this issue have not really been exhausted, and therefore we took it on ourselves to discuss this at length. Go ahead.
You know, the term corridor would lead one to believe that this is a sort of an elongated road through which one goes from one place to another. Actually, it's not a road, it's a dam, supposed to be, like the Hoover Dam or the Grand Coulee Dam, and it's supposed to hold off imports and exports from either side of the Gaza-Egypt border. Now, of course, it's leaking all over the place, both overground and underground. The fact that the IDF is now in control of it and has been systematically devastating the entire tunnel system gives one hope that it can be sustained either by continued presence or electronically, or better yet, some combination of an electronic system and a multinational force, especially on the Egyptian side. And you have such a force available in the MFO, the Multinational Force and Observers, which is headquartered not too far from there in the El Arish area of Egypt, and has, of course, another mission altogether, which has to do with the Israeli-Egyptian annex, the security defense annex to the peace treaty. So if there's a will, there's a way, and there's a corridor, it can be solved. However, the political echelon in Israel, led by Netanyahu, the prime minister, insists on holding onto the corridor, whether for itself or whether in the hope that as long as this goes on, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, will be captured or killed, the hostages will be released, and Netanyahu could declare victory.
Indeed. Well, Colonel Eisen, I'd like to start with you. While visiting Washington a couple of months ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with one of the former national security advisors of Israel. Actually, I spoke with a number of them who all happened to be in Washington back then, but nonetheless, one of them highlighted to me after asking him a simple question. Why, when attacking Gaza, after Hamas launched its atrocities on October 7th, did Israel not go for one of the most strategic corridors that basically maintained an oxygen line to the Islamist Hamas in this enclave? And he came up with a couple of answers, which I won't have enough time to elaborate on. Nevertheless, I'd love to hear your position.
In October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel, one of the very cynical aspects is that they went cross-border, they went across the fence, they came from the air, they came from the sea, and Jonathan, they didn't come from underground because Israel had taken care of those attack tunnels from the Gaza Strip into Israel in the aftermath of the different events that have happened. And I say that because I expected after October 7th that there would be a fast, rapid force that would go in and first and foremost take what we call the Philadelphia corridor, take that borderline between Egypt, a sovereign state, and the Gaza Strip under Hamas. And there's no question whatsoever that that was one of the questions of what we should do militarily. But we have to remember where we were as a country, as a leadership, as a military on October 7th. We were not in a good place. And the Israeli response to me was much more about the hostages, about trying to damage, about going in and looking at all of the Gaza Strip and not looking at it overall and saying, what should we do first? There were voices at that time that said that the first thing that should be done is to go in and do Philadelphia corridor. Only doing it after almost 7 months of war was late, but now that it's done, it has to do with nipping what Emil was also mentioning before, the smuggling overground and overground, the possibility of smuggling hostages out is one thing, the top echelon of the Hamas is another, and that's into Sinai, which is part of Egypt. And so in that sense, it's about decisions. I disagree with that decision, but it doesn't matter in hindsight.
Thank you, Colonel Eisen. Professor Berman, I'd like to start with focusing on the Philadelphia corridor from another angle, and that is, if we look at the earth of the Gaza Strip, it's very sandy, roughly 30 meters depth. We have underground water, so there is a viable option for a subterranean barrier, very much as Colonel Eisen also mentioned, an effective subterranean barrier that was established around the Gaza Strip and therefore forced the Islamist Hamas to fight overground. And then within that context, of course, to have various sensors and all kind of high-tech implemented with oversight flights that may then provide additional intelligence if Hamas were to exploit a certain ceasefire for its belligerent purposes, which would then, of course, also effectively draw Israel into abruptly ending such a cessation of hostilities. Nevertheless, when we're looking at all these various angles that may challenge a Israeli presence, and of course, I'm just establishing some perspectives to this strategic corridor. Is the United States taking all of the various considerations and challenges into account? And even if such an underground barrier were to be erected, this would take time and would not stand within the schedule which the Biden administration would have hoped for.
I think it's important to remember that after October 7th, there was considerable pressure on Israel not to undertake certain incursions. There was recoiling at the bombing. And remember the warnings not to go into Rafah. Not to go into Rafah is directly related to the question of the Philadelphia corridor. So I'm not in a position to engage in after the fact judgment on the internal Israeli discussions as to when they should go to Philadelphia or not. It's clearly the lifeline for Hamas, and to give it up would be suicidal for Israel at this point, given the announced strategy of Hamas. As you point out, Jonathan, there are specific engineering challenges, the sand, the water. I don't know, could an underground wall be built along the whole Philadelphia corridor that would obviate the need for troops to monitor it? Uh, I guess that's a strategic, but also just an engineering challenge on which I can't speak. A shorter version of that, or a less ambitious version, is the notion of electronic monitoring of the border. But electronic monitoring, I think we should all remember, is exactly what didn't work on October 7th. If I were an Israeli strategist, I'd be very, very suspicious about claims this could all be done with sensors along the length of Philadelphia. Holding on to Philadelphia is the stranglehold on Hamas at this point. Perhaps there'd be an alternative of some kind of mixed international troop, but the formula for that remains elusive.
Before the October 7th massacre, there was a period where the Philadelphia corridor and the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip was not even a matter of discussion. It was from time to time opened for civilians overground by the Egyptians, who seized control, of course, of the Rafah border crossing for quite some time. And underground, to alleviate foreign concerns, the Egyptians announced at the time, talking about several years ago, that they have established all kind of waters for the growth of shrimp, and that was supposed to utilize also for the feeding of the Egyptian military and other ways of export of shrimp, of course. But when we're talking about the fact of the matter was corruption was so heavy amongst the Egyptian ranks that we saw that no solution was actually implemented, since the Gazans and the Egyptians alike had mutual interests here, and they were fiscal interests.
Corruption in the Levant? Perish the thought. How could you come up with such a notion that people are corrupt in this region, and that poor customs officials or border guards can be bribed in order to let Hamas and others smuggle? It's a novel notion. One has to consider it. If there is enough pressure on the Egyptian government, because they will suffer if they do not do it, they will reluctantly take some steps. Now, Russell doubted whether it's feasible to build this underground wall. This is exactly what Israel did after 2014 with great fanfare. And as Miri said, it didn't do a lot of good because they came above ground. However, it can be done. It's the 14 kilometers of Philadelphia. This is exactly 1/4 of the 60 kilometers of the Israeli wall. If the Egyptians are serious, they can do it on their side of the border. Hamas, or whoever rules Gaza, would not like to get into a fight with the Egyptians. It's a matter of political will.
Colonel Eisen, I'd like to hear your take on this as well, but also when we're talking about war, perception is very important. And the fact of the matter is that Hamas has been trying to win a certain image of victory, irrespective of what type of cessation of hostilities is implemented. It is banking upon the international community to pressure Israel to a point of ending hostilities, irrespective of its state, and therefore it wants to gain as much as possible that imagery and perception that Hamas, the small Palestinian resistance movement, al-Muqawama, has come and challenged the great power of Israel. Is that something that Israel can accept in any equation? Also when referring to the Philadelphia corridor, but also beyond that, is that resonating in Washington, in your opinion?
So I'm going to start from the beginning and take it forward in that sense. The Islamist organization Hamas, in that sense, over more than 10 years, It's defined in Egypt as a terror organization, and it's important that people realize that it isn't that Egypt itself as a country or the government is officially, let's say, acquiescing in any way. No, they define Hamas as a terror organization, and Egypt are threatened by what Hamas both represents in the Muslim Brotherhood sense, but also because that whole smuggling of weapons facilitated, as said, through corruption and bribery, sad reality. By the way, not just in the Middle East, let's not make us the worst place on earth. I have a feeling corruption and bribery exist in other places as well, but I'm with my problems. And I say that because I think that Sinai, as the area in Egypt that is used for the smuggling of weapons to Hamas through the Philadelphia corridor, also enabled horrific Islamic State organizations that were based in Sinai against Egypt. And this is where it connects also to the United States, because the United States has a very long-term, horrific own background when it comes to Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, what it does. And so here you do have something where you could come together, that erasing these capabilities that both enable other very extreme Islamist groups that are based in Egypt. Egypt is not a weak link in the Middle East, but it is definitely something that the United States backs, that they see at the end in this greater Middle East. So far, Egypt has been very much against Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist parties. So at the end, you get to pick and choose who you're working with in the Middle East. And in that connection, I would hope that in the United States, they would see the advantages of, I don't want to say pressuring Egypt, but of aligning Egypt with joint goals against these Islamists that could undermine Egyptian government, just like at the end, the attacks that they did against us, the most genocidal, horrific attacks that you can imagine. Islamists have attacked a lot of Egyptians in Sinai. So I think that could be a point where we could find something in common that could work to better that situation there.
Something for people to understand that a terror operative affiliated to Hamas does not pledge allegiance to Hamas, but rather to the Muslim Brotherhood, indicating the strong connection it has as opposed to those trying to water it down and establish certain disconnect between the two organizations. But Professor Berman, I'd like to hear your take on this as well, and also to what degree do the strategists and the practitioners in Washington take into calculation the matter of perception, which is so vitally important in the Middle East?
I agree with Mary that there is a potential for an alignment of the United States and Egypt in terms of security interests. But one problem is determining the question of how high up the corruption goes. Is this just a matter of border guard level corruption? Is this border guards cooperating with Bedouin tribes in the Sinai, or does it go all the way to influential offices in Cairo? I don't know. I think the Israeli leadership has to have a serious discussion with its Egyptian partners to determine what the real problem is here and how to crack down on it. Now, beyond that, yes, Egypt has an interest, has been pretty brutal actually in clamping down on the Muslim Brotherhood, but a question for me is to what extent that security ambition is basically in, shall I put it, core Egypt, and does it really extend to the Sinai Peninsula and by extension to the Philadelphia corridor, which is really just the end of the Sinai Peninsula. In some reads, the Sinai Peninsula is itself already chaos, overrun by tribes that are engaged in the smuggling and affiliated with terrorist organizations, and the Egyptian government doesn't really have full control there. So what's the Egyptian game here? Is it to regain control of Sinai and therefore its side of the Philadelphia corridor, or is this just the badlands of Egypt that the central government has given up on?
Indeed, Mr. Owen, we don't talk about this too often. Nevertheless, Without Sinai is still active, and the Egyptian government and military have a lot on their hands to ensure that this terrorist organization, namely the Sinai district of the Islamic State, does not rear its ugly head and yet again extract heavy costs from the Egyptian population. An organization, by the way, that initially began as Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. Actually, prior to that, it was called something else, but Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, again, family ties with people in the Gaza Strip, has been quite active in support of the coup, the legal coup, some may say, of Mohammed Morsi, and then subsequently subdued by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi when he took over the country and forced it on the retreat. Basically, it pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria, and has rediverted its attention elsewhere in alignment, of course, with this global jihadist organization. Is all of this somehow also establishing additional strain right now on the Egyptians when they look at the Philadelphia corridor?
At times, the jihadi organizations under whatever name fought against Hamas. Then at other times, they collaborated with it, as is quite common, not only in this region, but as Miri correctly mentioned, in several places around the world. Now, whoever is operating in the Sinai is posing at least a double threat to the Sisi regime. One, because it can disrupt tourism to Sinai, to Sharm el-Sheikh, as it did when it downed a plane several years ago. Tourists stopped going there and the Egyptian economy suffered. And also because the Sisi regime, as Professor Berman said, brutally acted against them, it has a problem with human rights with Washington. Not always, but under certain presidents, it does. So yes, the Egyptians have an interest in bringing this war in Gaza to a close. One wonders, Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is such a master of language. He doesn't have to call it the end of hostilities. There are so many words. During the Cold War, the US military had a term, operations short of war. So let's talk about arrangements short of peace, armistice, ceasefire, operational halt. This is just a break between campaigns. It's better for all of us to stop the war in Gaza, at least for a while, and look north and look east towards the West Bank. Perhaps we will go back to fighting Hamas on our own terms.
Nevertheless, yesterday in the morning we had, of course, during our Israel at War update, Dr. Rafael Barrachi, during which he did highlight very sternly that unless Israel attains total victory against Hamas, it will be perceived in the Arab world as a defeat of Israel, which will have far more ramifications to Israel's security than what the prolonged activities in the Gaza Strip right now may entail. But of course, this is for a whole additional discussion, and I'd like to give Colonel Eisen and Professor Berman a final say. What are we to expect in the near future from your perspective, or an advice to the leadership about the course of action that needs to be taken vis-a-vis the Philadelphia corridor? Colonel Eisen, we'll start with you.
I don't think there's any place which is a must, and that means that in the Philadelphia corridor, it's not just about Israel military sitting there, it's also about the relations with Egypt, the relations within the Middle East, and in this place, I state, sadly, I think that there's some give and take. So I would advise to keep on with the very strategic relationship that we have with this government of Egypt, corruption or not corruption. I think that's more important than physically being there right now. Having said that, it's a big challenge.
Indeed. Professor Berman?
Egypt's big vulnerability is, of course, its economy, its budget. And that's where the Biden administration, where the United States could put pressure on Egypt to cooperate more effectively along the Philadelphia corridor. The question is whether Egypt really wants to do that and whether it can overcome corruption at the ground level. From the other side, I can't see any desirable solution that would make the Philadelphia corridor porous. That is to say, there's no substitute for boots on the ground. At this point, the only boots on the ground are IDF boots. I could imagine perhaps some international Arab force, UAE, maybe even Saudi forces there, cooperating with the Israelis, but the IDF is not going to pull out until Hamas is defeated. Otherwise, as has been pointed out, this would be regarded as a defeat for Israel.
Indeed. Earlier this week, we had the European Union High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, visiting the Philadelphia corridor as well as the Rafah border crossing, after which he was asked during a press briefing whether or not the European Union was considering to send forces. He said too early to even discuss this, so we'll have to wait and see what this also evolves into. The last 20 seconds.
If there was any impression of a condescending attitude when we spoke about corruption in Egypt or elsewhere, in Israel we have our own share of corruption in the corridors of power.
And yet we also have a strong judiciary that can contend with those realities.
Hopefully.
And we already have prime ministers and presidents in prison for that. So we'll put that aside. Anyways, I'd like to thank Colonel Eisen and Professor Berman for all of your insights. I'd like to thank Mr. Owen, of course, and all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.